They say the most dangerous predator is the one you don't see coming, but in the case of Marcus Echo Sullivan, it was the one who couldn't see you at all. Across the sun-scorched territories of Arizona in the late 1870s, his name was whispered in saloons from Tombstone to Prescott, a legend that grew with each telling, the blind gunslinger who never missed. Some claimed he'd killed 30 men since losing his sight, each shot finding its mark with uncanny precision. Others swore he could hear a man's intentions in his heartbeat, feel the shift of air when someone reached for iron, and smell fear like a wolf scenting wounded prey. "The eyes can deceive," he once told a young deputy who dared to ask how he did it. "But the truth of a man's soul echoes in every breath he takes, every step he makes, every word he speaks." That's how he earned his nickname, Echo, though few were brave enough to use it to his face. Join me today as we delve into the extraordinary tale of the man they called the Blind Prophet of Death, and discover how a terrible loss became an unprecedented gift. If this story touches your soul, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's tale might just change the way you see the world. But first, tell us in the comments, what would you do if your greatest weakness became your strongest weapon? Yuma Territory, Arizona, spring, 1878. The town of Devil's Fork lay baking under a merciless sun, its wooden buildings sweating pitch in the heat, while dust devils danced down the main street like restless spirits. It was the kind of place most folks passed through without stopping, a den of thieves and killers where the law was whatever the strongest gun said it was, which is exactly why Marcus Sullivan chose it. He rode in on a Tuesday morning, his black horse picking its way carefully down the rutted street, as if it knew its master couldn't see the way. The local vultures, human and otherwise, took notice immediately. A stranger was nothing new in Devil's Fork, but this one was different. He sat straight in the saddle, his face partially hidden by the brim of a well-worn cavalry hat, and his eyes were hidden behind dark glasses, the kind doctors sometimes prescribed for sensitivity to light. "Look what we got here, boys," drawled Tex Hawley from his perch outside the Broken Spoke Saloon. "Either this fella's too good to look at our dirty little town, or—" He let the words hang in the air, drawing chuckles from his companions. But old Jake Wheeler, who had been tending bar in Devil's Fork since before the war, noticed something else. The stranger's gun belt was worn high and tight, the holster positioned for a cross-draw. The Colt Peacemaker it carried showed signs of regular use, not the kind of wear that comes from routine cleaning, but the smooth patches that only appear when steel meets leather thousands of times. Marcus guided his horse to the hitching post outside Wheeler's bar, dismounting with fluid grace that seemed at odds with his apparent condition. His boots hit the wooden sidewalk with barely a sound, and he stood for a moment, head slightly tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly despite its low volume. "I believe there are 4 of you on the porch. The man who spoke is standing, the others sitting. One of you has spurs that need oiling, they sing off-key." The laughter died in their throats. Tex Hawley's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, then froze as Marcus's head turned unerringly toward him. "I wouldn't," Marcus said, still quiet, still calm. "The sound of a hammer being cocked carries far in this dry air. By the time you cleared leather, you'd have 3 holes in you, 1 for each breath you just took." Inside the saloon, Jake Wheeler felt a chill despite the heat. He'd seen his share of hard men, but something about this stranger's certainty made his spine tingle. The way he moved, the way he spoke. It wasn't bravado or bluff. It was the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of and exactly how far others would push him. The silence stretched like old leather, cracking finally when Marcus turned toward the saloon doors. "I'll have whiskey, Mr. Wheeler," he said, though no one had introduced the bartender. "And information about a man named Clayton Blackwood, if you've got any to spare." At the mention of Blackwood's name, the temperature in Devil's Fork seemed to drop 10 degrees, despite the Arizona sun blazing overhead. Clayton Blackwood was more than just another outlaw. He was the devil that gave Devil's Fork its name. And somehow, this blind stranger had just announced he was looking for him. The story of how Marcus Sullivan lost his sight and found his true vision was about to begin, and Devil's Fork would never be the same. Jake Wheeler's weathered hands trembled slightly as he poured the whiskey, watching the blind stranger settle himself at the bar. The man's movements were precise, deliberate, one hand maintaining the lightest contact with the bar's edge while the other found the glass as if he could see it plain as day. "Blackwood's a dangerous name to speak in these parts," Wheeler said quietly, glancing at the saloon's other patrons. Most were trying their best to look uninterested, but their tension was palpable. "Man's got eyes and ears everywhere." "Good thing I only need ears then," Marcus replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He took a slow sip of whiskey, his head tilted slightly as he cataloged the sounds around him. The nervous shuffle of boots on wooden floors, the subtle creak of floorboards as people shifted their weight, the whispered conversations that died when he turned his head their way. Outside, Tex Hawley and his boys had regained some of their bravado. They filed into the saloon, spurs jingling discordantly, positioning themselves around Marcus with practiced intimidation. But the blind gunslinger didn't seem concerned. If anything, his smile widened slightly. "3 men," he said softly, "moving to surround me. One at 2 o'clock, another at 4, and you, Mr. Hawley, thinking you're being clever by staying behind me." He took another sip. "Your gun oil is rancid, by the way. Makes a distinctive sound when the cylinder turns. Before we continue with what happened next in that saloon, I want you to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals exactly how Marcus Sullivan learned to turn darkness into his greatest weapon. Now back to Devil's Fork." Tex Hawley's face darkened with rage. "You think you're real smart, don't you? Coming in here, throwing around Blackwood's name, making your fancy observations?" He leaned closer, his breath hot with cheap whiskey. "But I'm wondering how well you can shoot when you can't even see your own hand in front of your face." The saloon went deadly quiet. Even the old ceiling fan seemed to slow its creaking rotation as if holding its breath. Marcus set his glass down with careful precision, the soft clink against the bar top loud as a gunshot in the silence. "Mr. Hawley," he said, voice still quiet but carrying an edge sharp as a razor. "I've killed 17 men since losing my sight. Each one of them thought the same thing you're thinking right now. Each one of them made the same mistake you're about to make." He turned his head slightly, those dark glasses somehow finding Hawley's eyes. "Would you like to know what that mistake was?" Wheeler's hand had found his shotgun under the bar, but something told him he wouldn't need it. The way Marcus carried himself, the absolute certainty in his voice, this wasn't going to be a fair fight. It wasn't going to be a fight at all. "They assumed," Marcus continued, "that because I couldn't see them, I was helpless. But you see, Mr. Hawley, the eyes lie. They show you what's on the surface, distract you with appearances. Without them," he gestured slightly with one hand, "without them, you learn to see the truth. Like how your heart just started beating faster, how your breathing changed, how the leather of your holster creaked when you shifted your weight to your right foot, the tell of a man about to draw." The tension in the saloon had become unbearable. Hawley's face was a mask of confusion and growing fear, realizing too late that he'd stepped into something far deeper than he'd intended. But pride and whiskey were powerful motivators, and his hand was already moving toward his gun. What happened next would be talked about in Devil's Fork for years to come, and it would be only the beginning of the legend of the blind gunslinger. But first, Marcus Sullivan was about to teach Tex Hawley and his boys a lesson about the difference between seeing and truly observing. Time seemed to slow in the Broken Spoke saloon as Tex Hawley's hand moved toward his gun. The other patrons were already diving for cover, their scrambling boots creating a symphony of sound that Marcus Sullivan read like a map of the room. But before we reveal what happened next, let me remind you to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because tomorrow's episode uncovers the tragic story that set this all in motion. Hawley's gun had barely cleared leather when Marcus moved. His draw was a thing of terrible beauty, smooth as flowing water and twice as fast. The peacemaker seemed to materialize in his hand, its report deafening in the confined space. Hawley's gun went spinning across the floor, a precise shot having struck it directly on the hammer, numbing the outlaw's hand but leaving him otherwise unharmed. "That was your first lesson," Marcus said quietly, his gun trained unerringly on Hawley's chest. "Would you like a second?" One of Hawley's companions, a wiry man with a nervous trigger finger, decided to try his luck. The whisper of his boot heel turning on wooden planks was all Marcus needed. His second shot took the man's hat off, along with a few strands of hair. "There's your second lesson," Marcus continued, his voice still calm, almost pedagogical. "Now who wants to learn about the difference between hearing a man's intention and hearing his fear?" The third member of Hawley's gang had been slowly repositioning himself, trying to get an angle. Marcus's head turned slightly toward him. "Your spurs give you away, friend. 3 steps back, or the next sound they make will be hitting the floor with the rest of you." Jake Wheeler, watching from behind his bar, had never seen anything like it. The blind gunslinger moved with absolute certainty, responding to threats before they fully materialized. It wasn't just the speed or accuracy of his shots, it was the way he read the room, the way he seemed to see more than men with working eyes. "How?" Hawley gasped, cradling his stinging hand. "How can you—" "When you lose your sight," Marcus explained, keeping his gun steadily positioned. "The world doesn't go dark. It gets louder. Every footstep tells a story. Every breath reveals intention. The creak of leather, the shift of weight, the whisper of cloth. They all speak to those who know how to listen." He holstered his gun with the same fluid grace with which he'd drawn it. "Now, Mr. Hawley, I believe you and your friends were just leaving, and I'd suggest spreading the word. The blind man in the saloon isn't looking for trouble, but he's found plenty of it before." The 3 men backed away, their earlier bravado replaced by a newfound respect for the darkness behind those dark glasses. As they reached the door, Marcus added one final observation. "And Mr. Hawley, you might want to have that gun looked at. The timing on your cylinder's off. I could hear it dragging before you drew." As the saloon's batwing doors swung shut behind the chastened outlaws, the other patrons began emerging from their hiding spots. The atmosphere had changed completely. What had started as mockery and disbelief had transformed into something approaching awe. Jake Wheeler approached carefully, bearing a fresh bottle of whiskey. "That was quite a show, Mr. Sullivan. But if you're really looking for Clayton Blackwood, you should know. Shows won't be enough. Man's got an army of killers working for him, and they won't all be as easily handled as Tex Hawley." Marcus's face grew serious. "I'm counting on that, Mr. Wheeler, because Blackwood needs to understand what's coming for him. He needs to hear the whispers, feel the uncertainty spread through his ranks. By the time I finally face him, he'll know exactly what it feels like to be blind to what's hunting you." Wheeler studied the stranger carefully. There was something in his voice, something that went deeper than just another manhunter chasing a bounty. "What did Blackwood do to you, Mr. Sullivan?" Marcus touched his dark glasses almost absently. "That's a story for another time. But first, I need to know everything you can tell me about his operation. Because before this is over, Clayton Blackwood is going to learn that some things are worse than darkness." Before we delve deeper into Jake Wheeler's knowledge of Clayton Blackwood's operation, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's episode reveals a shocking connection between our blind gunslinger and the devil of Devil's Fork that no one saw coming. The afternoon sun had transformed the Broken Spoke Saloon into a cave of whispered conversations and long shadows. Most patrons had cleared out after Marcus's display of marksmanship, leaving him alone at the bar with Wheeler and a handful of regulars too curious or too drunk to leave. "Blackwood's got his fingers in everything," Wheeler began, keeping his voice low as he polished glasses with mechanical precision. "Started with protection rackets, moved into cattle rustling, then the silver shipments. Now he's got half the territorial officials in his pocket and the other half too scared to move against him." Marcus nodded slightly, his acute hearing picking up the fear beneath Wheeler's carefully measured words. "Tell me about his men. Numbers, habits, the way they operate." "Main force is about 40 strong. but he's got others scattered through the territory. Most dangerous are his inner circle, the Shadow Riders, he calls them. 7 men, each one a killer in his own right. Wheeler paused, glancing around nervously. They say his second in command, a Mexican named Ramirez, once killed an entire family just to send a message. Even the children. Marcus's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his glass. When was this? About 8 months back. The Mackenzie family up near Prescott. Father was a marshal who wouldn't take Blackwood's bribes. They found him and his wife. Wheeler's voice trailed off. Only the youngest daughter survived, and that's because she was visiting relatives in California. The blind gunslinger's face remained impassive, but something in his posture had changed. Wheeler, who'd spent decades reading men across his bar, noticed the shift immediately. "You knew them," he said softly. It wasn't a question. "James Mackenzie was more than a marshal," Marcus replied, his quiet voice carrying an edge of carefully controlled pain. "He was the man who taught me everything I know about tracking, about reading people, about surviving out here. After I lost my sight, he was the only lawman who believed I could still serve justice." Wheeler refilled Marcus's glass without being asked. "And his daughter? The one who survived?" Sarah. For the first time, a genuine smile touched Marcus's lips. "My fiancée. She's safe in San Francisco where Blackwood can't reach her, but she deserves to know her family's killer faced judgment." The revelation hung in the air like gun smoke. Wheeler had served enough drinks to enough killers to recognize the difference between revenge and justice. What he heard in Marcus's voice was something else entirely, a calling, a mission that went beyond personal vengeance. "How did it happen?" he asked finally. "Your eyes, I mean?" Marcus touched his dark glasses again, a habit that seemed almost unconscious. "Acid. 2 years ago, during a raid on a gang of bank robbers, one of them had a flask of it, meant for the safe. He threw it at my face instead." He paused, head tilting as he tracked the movement of someone crossing the street outside. "Best thing that ever happened to me." Wheeler blinked in surprise. "Best thing? How do you figure that?" "Because it taught me to see what others miss. When you rely on your eyes, you see what's on the surface, appearances, deceptions, the lies people want you to believe. But when you learn to see with your other senses..." Marcus gestured subtly toward the saloon doors. "Like right now. 3 men just entered the alley across the street. They're trying to move quietly, but their gun belts are rattling. New leather. Blackwood's men always have the best equipment. Word of our little demonstration has already reached him." Wheeler instinctively reached for his shotgun, but Marcus's hand stopped him. "No need for that, friend. Let them come. Every man they send is another thread leading me closer to Blackwood himself. And soon, very soon, he's going to learn what true blindness feels like." If you've been following our story so far, you know that Marcus Sullivan's reputation is about to be put to the test. But before we see how our blind gunslinger handles Blackwood's men, take a moment to subscribe, because tomorrow's episode reveals a betrayal that will shake Devil's Fork to its core. The afternoon heat had begun to wane, casting longer shadows across Devil's Fork's dusty street. Inside the broken spoke, Marcus remained at the bar, seemingly unconcerned about the approaching danger. But Jake Wheeler noticed how the blind gunslinger's head was slightly tilted, tracking something only he could hear. "They're coordinating," Marcus said softly. "One's moving around to the back door. The other 2 are splitting up, one to each front entrance." His lips curved in a slight smile. "Confident, professional, but their boots are too new. The leather squeaks with every step." Wheeler's hand stayed near his shotgun. "How do you want to play this?" "Just keep serving drinks, Mr. Wheeler, and when it starts, stay behind your bar." Marcus took another sip of whiskey. "They're going to try something clever. They always do." The batwing doors swung open with deliberate slowness. A tall man in a black duster stepped in, his spurs singing a sharp, clean note with each step. "New spurs," Marcus noted. Everything about him screamed money, Blackwood's trademark. "Marcus Sullivan!" the man called out, his voice carrying the cultured accent of an educated Easterner. "Mr. Blackwood sends his respects and an invitation to discuss your grievances like civilized men." "Jason Kincaid," Marcus replied, not turning around. "Former cavalry officer discharged for excessive brutality. You've killed 11 men since joining Blackwood, most of them from behind." He took another sip. "Your cologne gives you away. French, isn't it? Bit fancy for a hired killer." Kincaid's composed facade cracked slightly. "How did you—" "The same way I know your partner at the back door is favoring his left leg, old wound acting up in this heat, and your man at the other entrance is carrying a derringer in his left sleeve beyond his regular iron." Marcus set his glass down carefully. "The question is, will you be smart and leave now, or do we need to redecorate Mr. Wheeler's establishment?" A tense silence filled the saloon. The few remaining patrons had pressed themselves against the walls, recognizing the deadly dance unfolding before them. Kincaid's hand hovered near his gun, his confidence wavering as he processed Marcus's impossible knowledge of their positions. "Last chance," Kincaid said, but his voice had lost its cultured edge. "The boss wants to talk. Doesn't have to get messy." Marcus stood slowly, turning to face Kincaid. "Tell your boss I'm coming for him. Tell him what you see here today. Tell him that darkness is catching up to him, one shadow at a time." Everything happened at once. Kincaid went for his gun, fast and smooth. The back door burst open as his partner rushed in. The third man appeared at the other entrance, derringer sliding into his palm, but Marcus was already moving. His first shot caught Kincaid's bullet in midair, the collision of lead sending both shots wide. His second took the derringer out of the third man's hand along with 2 fingers. The backdoor attacker managed to fire once before Marcus's third shot shattered his shoulder. The entire exchange had lasted less than 3 seconds. Kincaid lay on the floor, his gun hand bleeding where Marcus's fourth shot had creased it. He stared up at the blind gunslinger with a mixture of fear and awe. What are you?" Marcus walked over to him, each step precise and measured. "I'm the consequence of your master's actions. I'm the darkness he created." He knelt down beside the wounded man. "Now take a message back to Blackwood. Tell him Echo is coming. And unlike him, I never miss my mark." As Blackwood's men limped and staggered out of the saloon, Jake Wheeler let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. But something told him this was just the beginning. The real storm was still gathering, and Devil's Fork was about to become its epicenter. Before we continue with the aftermath of Marcus Sullivan's latest display of extraordinary marksmanship, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode reveals a secret about Clayton Blackwood's past that changes everything. Now, back to Devil's Fork. As the evening shadows lengthened across Devil's Fork, word of the confrontation at the Broken Spoke spread like wildfire. Dr. Thomas Morrison, the town's tired-looking physician, had just finished patching up Blackwood's men when a rider came thundering in from the east, kicking up dust that painted the sunset blood red. Inside the saloon, Marcus sat quietly at the bar, his acute hearing picking up the approaching hoofbeats long before anyone else. "Company coming," he murmured to Wheeler. "Single rider pushing hard. Military training by the sound of it, keeping a rhythm even at that speed." The rider burst through the bat-wing doors moments later, spurs jingling with urgency. Marcus's head tilted slightly, reading volumes in the newcomer's movements. "Deputy Marshal Sarah Collins," he said softly. "You're a long way from Prescott." The woman froze, her hand instinctively moving toward her gun before recognition dawned. "Marcus? They said you were here, but I didn't believe—" She caught herself, remembering their surroundings. "We need to talk. Privately." Wheeler gestured toward a back room, but before Marcus could rise, Sarah added something that made the blind gunslinger go very still. "It's about James Mackenzie's case. We found something." The back room smelled of stale tobacco and old leather, its single window casting weak light across a scarred table. Sarah paced while Marcus sat perfectly still, his enhanced senses building a picture of her agitation. 2 days ago, she began, we arrested one of Blackwood's men, a bookkeeper named Harrison. He was dying, gut shot by his own people for skimming money. Before he passed, he started talking. The Mackenzie massacre. It wasn't just about sending a message. Marcus's fingers drummed once on the table, the only sign of his tension. Go on. James was building a case bigger than anyone realized. He'd found a connection between Blackwood and someone high up in the territorial government. Someone who's been helping him stay untouchable. She paused, her voice dropping lower. The papers proving it were hidden in the Mackenzie house. That's why they burned it down. But they didn't find what they were looking for, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. No. Sarah's boots scraped against the wooden floor as she leaned closer. Because James Mackenzie was smarter than that. Harrison said he heard Blackwood's men talking. The papers are still out there, hidden somewhere only James would know to look. A ghost of a smile touched Marcus's lips. The old stone well, he said softly. Behind the ruins of the house. James showed me once. There's a hollow space beneath one of the stones, waterproof and deep. He used it during his army days to pass messages. Sarah's breath caught. You're sure? I can still feel the grooves he carved into the stone. 3 notches on the north side. He made me memorize it by touch. Said someday I might need a secure hiding place of my own. Marcus stood, his movements precise and controlled. How many men does Blackwood have watching the Mackenzie property? At least 6 last time we checked. But Marcus... She hesitated. There's something else. Harrison mentioned a name before he died. Said this government connection, whoever it is coming to Devil's Fork next week. Some kind of meeting with Blackwood. Marcus nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. Then we have a week to get those papers, to finish what James started. His hand found his gun, checking it with practiced familiarity. But first, we need to understand exactly what we're walking into. Tell me everything Harrison said, every detail you can remember. In my experience, dying men often speak more truth than they intend. Outside, the sun had finally surrendered to the night, plunging Devil's Fork into darkness. But for Marcus Sullivan, who had learned to see truth in shadows, the path ahead was becoming increasingly clear. James Mackenzie's last secret was waiting to be found, and with it, the key to bringing down not just Clayton Blackwood, but an entire web of corruption that stretched to the highest levels of power. If you're just joining our story, make sure to check out the previous episodes to understand why Marcus Sullivan and Deputy Marshal Collins are about to attempt what many would call impossible. And don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's episode reveals a twist that no one sees coming. The night had settled deep over Devil's Fork when Marcus and Sarah began laying out their plans in Wheeler's back room. The old bartender had joined them, bringing coffee and his decades of local knowledge to the table. Blackwood's men have turned the Mackenzie property into a fortress, Sarah explained, spreading out a rough map she'd drawn. 2 men on rotation at all times, plus regular patrols. They've even got a spotter on the ridge overlooking the well. Marcus ran his fingers lightly over the map, building a mental picture of the terrain. The ridge faces west, he said softly. Sun will be in their eyes at dusk. And the wind usually picks up around then, carrying sound away from the house. Wheeler watched in fascination as the blind gunslinger's fingers traced the pathways between landmarks. You've been there before, he observed. Recently. 3 times since James was killed. Stayed far enough out to avoid detection, but close enough to learn their patterns. Marcus's lips curved in a slight smile. Amazing what men will say when they think no one's listening in the dark. Sarah's chair creaked as she leaned forward. We'll need a distraction. Something big enough to draw their attention but not so obvious that... A sound from the street interrupted her. The rhythmic beat of multiple horses approaching at a walk. Marcus's head tilted, analyzing the cadence. 8 riders, he said quietly. Moving in formation. Military trained, but trying not to show it. Wheeler moved to the window. peering through a gap in the shutters. "Blackwood's Shadow Riders," he breathed, "including Ramirez himself." The name sent a chill through the room. Ramirez, Blackwood's notorious second-in-command, was known for his creative approach to violence. The man who had orchestrated the Mackenzie massacre was finally making his appearance. "They're spreading out," Marcus observed, tracking the sound of bootfalls and jingling spurs. 3 to the front, 2 covering each side street, 1 watching the back. Standard containment pattern. He stood, checking his gun with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Wheeler, is there a cellar access to the tunnels?" The bartender's eyes widened. "How did you—" "The hollow sound when you walk near the storage room. The faint draft from below. Every border town has escape tunnels from the old days. Devil's Fork must have been no different." Wheeler nodded slowly. "Bootleggers dug them during the war. They connect most of the main buildings, come out about half a mile outside town." Sarah's hand moved to her gun belt. "We can't run, Marcus. Not when we're this close." "No," Marcus agreed, "but we can choose our ground. Mr. Wheeler, I'll need you to deliver a message to Ramirez. Tell him the blind man who's been causing trouble would like to discuss terms." His voice took on an edge of steel. "Tell him I'll meet him and 2 men of his choice at dawn, out by Carson's Bluff." "That's suicide," Sarah hissed. "Even for you." Marcus turned toward her, and though his eyes were hidden behind dark glasses, his face held an expression of absolute certainty. "While Ramirez is focused on me, you'll have your chance at the well. The papers are what matter here. They're the key to finishing what James started." But before Sarah could argue further, a new sound caught Marcus's attention. His hand shot up, signaling for silence. "Someone in the tunnel," he whispered. Moving fast, trying to stay quiet. About 30 yards out and closing. Wheeler reached for the shotgun mounted behind the bar, but Marcus's hand stopped him. "No," the blind gunslinger said softly. "Let them come. Sometimes the best way to understand what your enemy is planning," he drew his peacemaker with fluid grace, "is to let them think they've surprised you." The night was about to become very interesting indeed. Before we see how Marcus handles the approaching threat in the tunnels beneath Devil's Fork, take a moment to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode reveals a secret about Sarah that changes everything. Now, back to our story. The darkness beneath Devil's Fork was absolute, the kind that swallows light and hope alike. But for Marcus Sullivan, darkness had long since ceased to be an enemy. If anything, it was his most faithful ally. 2 more joined the first one, he whispered, head tilted to track the sounds echoing through the tunnel system. "They're trying to coordinate, but these passages are confusing them. The acoustics are playing tricks." Sarah and Wheeler had taken positions behind overturned tables, but Marcus remained standing, completely at ease in the blackness. A faint smile touched his lips as he noted the irony. Down here, everyone else was as blind as him. "The tunnel branches 30 feet ahead," he continued softly. "They'll have to split up or bunch together either way." His hand rested lightly on his holstered peacemaker. "They're about to learn why darkness is my territory." The first shot came from the left tunnel, a wild attempt to light up the room with muzzle flash. Marcus had already moved, his return fire striking the man's gun hand with surgical precision. The howl of pain echoed through the passages, transformed by the acoustics into something otherworldly. "That's one," Marcus said calmly. "The other 2 are hesitating now, heartbeats getting faster. They've realized their mistake." Sarah watched in amazement as Marcus seemed to flow through the darkness, each movement precise and purposeful. He wasn't just comfortable in the black void. He was its master. A voice called out from the tunnels, trying to sound confident but betrayed by a slight tremor. "Sullivan! Ramirez wants to talk terms. This doesn't have to get messy." "3 things," Marcus replied, his quiet voice carrying effortlessly through the passages. "First, you're lying. Your breathing changes with deception. Second, Your partner is trying to circle around through the north tunnel, but his spurs are giving him away. And third, he paused, head tilting slightly. You really shouldn't be standing next to a gunpowder barrel with a lit match. The man's sharp intake of breath confirmed Marcus's impossible knowledge. In the pitch darkness, he had somehow detected the faint sulfur smell of the match and the distinctive hollow echo of the powder keg. How? The man started to ask, but Marcus cut him off. The same way I know you're wearing a cavalry sword that's too big for you, probably taken off a dead officer. The same way I know your friend in the north tunnel has a bad chest cold he's trying to hide. When you live in darkness long enough, you learn to see with more than just your eyes. The tension in the tunnels had become unbearable. Wheeler, despite his years of experience with hard men, found himself holding his breath. Sarah's hand tightened on her gun, though she knew better than to fire in these close quarters. Last chance, Marcus offered. Drop your weapons and walk away. Tell Ramirez that if he wants to talk, he knows where to find me. But if you insist on continuing this. The smile was gone from his voice now, replaced by something cold and certain. Well, let's just say the darkness down here is hungry tonight. A moment of silence stretched like old leather. Then the sound of 2 guns hitting the dirt floor echoed through the tunnels, followed by retreating footsteps. Marcus waited until they were well away, before finally relaxing his stance. They'll be back, Sarah said, finally lowering her own weapon. And next time Ramirez will come himself. Good, Marcus replied softly. Because what just happened here? That was just a message. When Ramirez comes, we'll add another chapter to the legend of the blind gunslinger, one that'll have them whispering in saloons from here to Mexico. Wheeler studied their unlikely protector with newfound respect. You knew they were coming all along, didn't you? This whole thing was a demonstration. Marcus's slight nod was barely visible in the darkness. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make your enemies realize they've already lost. And Ramirez ... His hand brushed the grip of his peacemaker. Ramirez needs to understand exactly what he's up against. But even as he spoke, high above in Devil's Fork, new pieces were being moved into position. The real game was about to begin. Before we see how Ramirez responds to the humiliation of his men in the tunnels, take a moment to subscribe, because tomorrow's episode reveals a shocking truth about Clayton Blackwood that will change everything. Now, back to Devil's Fork. Miguel Ramirez stood in the flickering lamplight of Blackwood's private office above the Golden Palace saloon, his scarred face a mask of contained fury as he listened to his men's report. The room smelled of expensive cigars and cheap fear, the latter emanating from the 3 failed assassins who stood before him. He knew we were there, one of them insisted, still nursing his wounded hand. Knew exactly where we were, what we were carrying, even what we were thinking. It ain't natural, Mr. Ramirez. Man sees better blind than most do with working eyes. Ramirez's response was a study in controlled violence. The backhand strike was so fast his men barely saw it, but the speaker went down hard, blood spraying from his split lip. Natural? Ramirez's accent thickened with anger. You think Blackwood pays for natural? He pays for results. A knock at the door interrupted his building rage. Jason Kincaid entered, his usual Eastern refinement somewhat diminished by his bandaged gun hand. We may have something, he said, nodding respectfully to Ramirez. 2 of our watchmen at the Mackenzie property spotted Deputy Marshal Collins asking questions in Prescott about the old place. She's been going through James Mackenzie's old cases, too. Ramirez's dark eyes narrowed. The blind man shows up, starts causing trouble. Now a deputy marshal with connections to Mackenzie appears. He moved to the window, looking down at the dark streets of Devil's Fork. They're looking for something. The papers, Kincaid said quietly. The ones we never found. The Mexican killer's hand unconsciously moved to the rosary he wore, a habit that his men knew preceded his most violent decisions. Mackenzie hid something before we killed him. Something that could threaten El Jefe's entire operation. He turned back to the room, his face set with deadly purpose. How long until the government man arrives? 5 days, Kincaid replied. He's expecting everything to be settled by then. Ramirez smiled, an expression that had heralded death for countless victims. Then we have 4 days to break this ghost, find what he and the marshal are hunting, and restore order to Devil's Fork. He moved to his weapon rack, selecting a peculiar knife with a curved blade. Send word to our men in Prescott. I want to know everything about Sullivan's connection to the Mackenzies, and find out where Sarah Mackenzie is now. One of the failed assassins cleared his throat nervously. Sir, what about Sullivan's challenge, meeting him at Carson's Bluff at dawn? Oh, we'll meet him, Ramirez purred, testing the knife's edge with his thumb. But not as he expects. By sunrise tomorrow, everyone in Devil's Fork will learn what happens to those who challenge the Shadow Riders. He turned to Kincaid. How many men can you have in position by dawn? 20, maybe 25. The rest are watching the Mackenzie property and the town's escape routes. Ramirez nodded, his plan taking shape. Good. Very good. Position them during the night, when Sullivan arrives for his meeting. His smile widened, showing gold-capped teeth. Well, let's see how well a ghost does against an army. But even as he plotted, a soft sound caught his attention. Boots on the boardwalk below, moving with deliberate stealth. Ramirez went to the window again, scanning the darkness. For a moment, he could have sworn he saw a shadow move against shadow, something too fluid to be natural. Sir? Kincaid questioned, noting his leader's sudden tension. Ramirez shook his head, but his hand stayed near his gun. Send runners to all our men. Double the guards tonight. And bring me everything you can find about how Sullivan fights in darkness. He paused, an unfamiliar sensation of doubt creeping into his mind. Something tells me we're not the only ones preparing for tomorrow's dawn. In the streets below, the night seemed to shift and breathe, as if the darkness itself was watching, waiting, gathering its strength for the coming storm. Before we see how Marcus prepares for what could be his final dawn, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's episode reveals a connection between him and Ramirez that goes back further than anyone suspected. Now, back to our story. The hours before dawn found Marcus Sullivan in the back room of the Broken Spoke, methodically cleaning his peacemaker. Each movement was practiced, precise, a ritual he'd performed countless times since losing his sight. Sarah Collins watched him work, noting how his fingers checked each component with more accuracy than most men managed with working eyes. It's a trap, she said finally, breaking the tense silence. You know Ramirez won't play fair. Of course it's a trap. Marcus's voice held a hint of amusement. I'm counting on it. His fingers traced the barrel of his gun, checking for imperfections only he could feel. Tell me about the ridgeline around Carson's Bluff. Every detail you remember. Sarah closed her eyes, recalling the terrain. Rocky outcropping to the east, slopes down to a small valley, 3 large boulders on the north side, old lightning-struck oak tree to the south. The bluff itself rises about 30 feet steep on all sides except the western approach. Marcus nodded, absorbing the information. And the prevailing wind? From the northeast at dawn usually, carries dust and... She paused, understanding dawning. You're going to use the terrain itself as a weapon, aren't you? A slight smile touched his lips. Everything speaks if you know how to listen. The wind, the rocks, even the dust. He reassembled his gun with fluid grace. Ramirez thinks darkness is my only advantage. He doesn't understand that when you lose one sense, the whole world transforms. Every sound becomes a picture. Every breath tells a story. Wheeler entered quietly, carrying coffee and news. Riders have been moving out all night, he reported. At least 20 men, heading toward the bluff. They're trying to be quiet about it, but men who aren't used to stealth make more noise trying to be silent than they do moving normally, Marcus finished. They're positioning shooters on the ridge. Probably have men in the valley, too. He stood, holstering his weapon. Perfect. Sarah grabbed his arm. Marcus, this is suicide. Even for you. Let me bring in more deputies from Prescott. We can... No. His voice was gentle, but firm. This ends today one way or another. Ramirez needs to believe he has the upper hand. It's the only way we'll get close enough to what we really need. The papers, Wheeler said quietly. Marcus nodded. While they're focused on me at the bluff, their security at the Mackenzie property will be lighter. That's your chance, Sarah. Find what James hid. It's the key to everything. And if you don't survive? Her voice caught slightly on the words. Marcus turned toward her, and though his eyes were hidden behind dark glasses, his face held an expression of absolute certainty. James used to say that justice is like a river. It might take the long way around, but it always reaches its destination. His hand found hers, squeezing gently. Just be ready when you hear the shooting start. Wheeler cleared his throat. You'll need someone to watch your back. I may be old, but I can still... No, Marcus interrupted. The town needs you. When this is over, one way or another, people will need a steady hand to help them understand what's coming. He moved to the door, his steps as sure as any sighted man's. Besides, where I'm going, the darkness is all the backup I need. The pre-dawn air was cool and sharp as Marcus stepped out onto the boardwalk. His acute hearing picked up the subtle sounds of a town holding its breath, shuttered windows, whispered prayers, the distant positioning of gunmen preparing for what they thought would be an execution. But as he mounted his horse, Marcus Sullivan allowed himself another small smile. By sunrise, Devil's Fork would learn why some legends aren't just stories, and why the most dangerous predator is the one that learns to make darkness itself an ally. Before we witness the showdown at Carson's Bluff, take a moment to subscribe because tomorrow's episode reveals how Marcus Sullivan first learned to turn his blindness into an advantage. Now, back to our story. The first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of purple and gold as Marcus Sullivan rode toward Carson's Bluff. The morning wind carried the scent of sage and gunpowder, along with something else, the subtle sounds of men trying very hard to be quiet. 23, he whispered to himself, counting heartbeats and breathing patterns in the pre-dawn stillness. No. 24. A smile touched his lips as he detected the rasping breath of a man on the ridge attempting to control a persistent cough. Sloppy Ramirez, very sloppy. He guided his horse along the western approach, every sense alert to the symphony of information around him. Boot leather creaking against rocks, the metallic whisper of rifle barrels being adjusted, the subtle shift of gravel as men changed positions. Each sound painted a picture clearer than any eyes could see. That's far enough, Sullivan, Ramirez's voice carried from somewhere near the bluff's edge. Dismount and walk forward. Slowly. Marcus complied, his movements unhurried and precise. The rising sun warmed his face as he turned toward Ramirez's voice. Brought quite a crowd for a private meeting, he observed quietly. 24 men by my count, 12 on the ridge, 7 behind the boulders to the north, 5 more scattered in the brush below. He paused, head tilting slightly. And you, Ramirez, standing behind that lightning-struck oak. The one that still smells of char and old rain. A moment of uneasy silence followed his impossible inventory. Then Ramirez laughed, but there was an edge to it. Impressive trick, Ghost. Very impressive. But tricks won't save you today. Not tricks, Marcus corrected gently. The world speaks to those who know how to listen. Like the fact that your men's new boots haven't broken in yet. They creak differently than worn leather. Or how your closest shooter is so nervous his gun barrel keeps scratching against a rock. Small details, but they add up to a very clear picture. Clear enough to dodge 24 guns? Ramirez stepped out from behind the tree, his own confidence growing. You may be good, Sullivan, but you're still just one blind man. Marcus's smile widened slightly. That's where you're wrong, Miguel. I'm not just a blind man. His hand rested casually near his holster. I'm what you created the day you murdered James Mackenzie and his family. I'm the consequence of your actions. The darkness you thought would break me? He gestured at his dark glasses. It just taught me to see the truth. The truth? Ramirez spat. The truth is you're a dead man walking. The truth is... The truth, Marcus interrupted softly, is that while we've been talking, the wind has shifted. You can feel it, can't you? Coming from the northeast now, carrying the morning dust. Your men on the ridge will be squinting into it soon, their eyes watering. The sun's angle will blind the ones behind the boulders. And the 5 in the brush. He shook his head. They're downwind. I can smell their sweat, hear every nervous breath. Ramirez's composure cracked slightly. Enough. You want to die knowing why? Fine. Mackenzie was getting too close. The papers he hid, the evidence against Governor Harrison himself, Marcus finished calmly. Yes, I know all about the corruption, the bribes, the murders sanctioned from the highest office in the territory. James told me everything before you killed him. The Mexican killer's face twisted with rage. Then you know why you have to die. Why all of you have to. But Marcus had already moved, his draw faster than anything Ramirez's men had ever seen. The first shot split the morning air like thunder, and the real battle for Carson's Bluff was about to begin. Before we continue with the battle that will become legend across the territory, take a moment to subscribe, because tomorrow's episode reveals the true cost of Marcus Sullivan's gift. Now, back to Carson's Bluff. Marcus's first shot had been precisely calculated, striking the rock face above the ridgeline. The bullet's impact sent fragments of stone raining down on Ramirez's men, adding to the confusion of dust and early morning sun. Their return fire was immediate but hasty, dozens of rounds chewing up the ground where Marcus had been standing a split second before. But the blind gunslinger was already moving, each step placed with uncanny precision. He'd memorized the terrain through sound and air pressure, building a perfect map in his mind. While Ramirez's men were still adjusting their aim, 3 more shots rang out from Marcus's peacemaker. 3 rifles clattered to the ground, their owners clutching wounded hands. "He's flanking north!" someone shouted. But the wind carried the sound in the wrong direction, making it impossible to pinpoint Marcus's true position. "Hold your position," Ramirez commanded, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. The battlefield had become a chaos of echoes and shifting sounds, dust limiting visibility, conditions that transformed Marcus's blindness from a weakness into an overwhelming advantage. Having trouble seeing? Marcus's quiet voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, carried on the wind he'd known would rise with the sun. "Welcome to my world." 2 more shots, 2 more men down, their guns shattered by precise fire. Ramirez's men were professionals, hardened killers all, but they'd never faced anything like this. The blind gunslinger moved like a ghost through the mounting chaos, using the terrain exactly as he'd planned. The rising sun forced shooters to squint or look away, the dust caught in their eyes, making them blink at crucial moments. And through it all, Marcus's shots found their marks with devastating accuracy. "The oak tree," a shooter on the ridge called out, firing at a shadow. His bullet splintered wood, but Marcus had already moved, guided by the sound of shifting gravel and panicked breathing. 19, he counted softly to himself. Another shot, another gun destroyed. 18. The numbers weren't bodies. Marcus was systematically disarming Ramirez's small army, turning their numerical advantage into a liability. Ramirez himself had taken cover behind the lightning-struck oak, his legendary calm finally breaking. "Surround him," he shouted, He can't hear over your own gunfire." "Wrong again." Marcus's voice came from impossibly close. "The shots tell me where everyone is. Each muzzle flash creates a pressure wave. Each bullet disturbs the air." 2 more shots rang out. 16. The Mexican killer's rage finally erupted. Drawing his own gun, he stepped out from behind the tree, firing rapidly. But Marcus had already read his intention in the subtle shift of boot leather against bark, the intake of breath that preceded action. What happened next would be told and retold in every saloon from Devil's Fork to Mexico City. Marcus seemed to flow between the bullets, his movements guided by the sound of gunshots before they happened. His return fire struck Ramirez's gun with surgical precision, sending it spinning away. "Impressive," Ramirez snarled, drawing his signature knife. "But let's see how you do up close, Ghost." The knife's whisper through air was all Marcus needed. He sidestepped the first slash, caught Ramirez's wrist on the second. "You still don't understand," he said softly. "I don't need to see you to know exactly where you are." The remaining gunmen, those still capable of fighting, watched in awe as their legendary leader was systematically dismantled by a blind man. Every strike Ramirez attempted found empty air. Every movement was turned against him until finally, "Enough!" a new voice rang out across the bluff. "Drop your weapons, all of you!" Sarah Collins had returned, and she wasn't alone. But what she'd found at the Mackenzie property was about to change everything. Before we reveal what Sarah Collins discovered at the Mackenzie property, take a moment to subscribe because tomorrow's final episode brings all the pieces together in a way nobody sees coming. Now, back to Carson's Bluff. Sarah stood at the edge of the bluff, flanked by a dozen armed deputies. But it was the man beside her who drew every eye, Clayton Blackwood himself, his hands bound in iron, his usual arrogance replaced by grim resignation. "Stand down," Sarah commanded Ramirez's remaining men. "Your employer has already confessed to everything." Marcus's head tilted slightly, reading volumes in the subtle sounds around him, the shuffle of uncertain feet, the collective intake of breath, the way Blackwood's chains clinked with barely controlled rage. "The papers were exactly where you said they'd be, Marcus," Sarah continued, "but there was something else too. Something James Mackenzie left specifically for you." She pulled out a letter, its paper worn with age. "He knew, Marcus, he knew they were coming for him." "Of course he knew," Blackwood spat. "Mackenzie was too damn smart for his own good, had evidence against half the territorial government. But he made one mistake. He trusted the wrong person." Marcus went very still, the morning wind carrying more than just words to his acute senses. He could hear the strain in Sarah's voice, the tension in her movements. "What aren't you telling me?" "The letter," Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "It wasn't just evidence of corruption. James, he was building a case against Governor Harrison, yes, but he'd also uncovered something deeper, a conspiracy that went all the way to Washington." "And the one who betrayed him?" Marcus asked softly, though something in his tone suggested he already knew. "His own deputy," Blackwood laughed harshly. "The man who trained alongside you, Marcus. The one who taught you how to shoot after you lost your sight, Thomas Drake." The name hit like a physical blow. Thomas Drake had been more than just another lawman. He'd been the one who helped Marcus adapt after the acid attack, who taught him to use his other senses to compensate for his lost vision. "Drake's been working for Harrison the whole time," Sarah explained. "He's the one who told them about the papers, about James's investigation. And Marcus—" She hesitated. "He's here, in Devil's Fork. He arrived an hour ago with the governor's personal guard." The wind shifted, bringing new sounds from the direction of town, hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching fast. Marcus's hand moved to his gun, checking the remaining ammunition by touch. "How many rounds you got left, Ghost?" Ramirez asked, a hint of his old arrogance returning. "Because Drake's bringing 30 fresh men, all territorial guards. Even you can't fight those odds." "He doesn't have to," Sarah declared. "We have Blackwood's signed confession, the Mackenzie papers, and a dozen witnesses. It's over." but Marcus shook his head slowly. "No," he said softly. "It's not over. Because Thomas Drake isn't coming to arrest anyone. He's coming to bury everything, the evidence, the witnesses, all of it, just like he did at the Mackenzie house." As if to confirm his words, the first shots rang out from the direction of town. Sarah's deputies turned, raising their rifles, but they were caught in a deadly crossfire. The governor's men had split their forces, approaching from multiple directions. "Get Blackwood out of here," Marcus commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Get him and the evidence to Prescott. I'll handle Drake." "Marcus, no," Sarah protested. "You can't face him alone." A ghost of a smile touched the blind gunslinger's lips. "I won't be alone," he said quietly. "I'll have the darkness on my side, and Thomas Drake is about to learn what his student has become." The battle for Carson's Bluff was ending, but an even deadlier confrontation was about to begin. The student would face the teacher, and only one would walk away. If you've been following our story of the blind gunslinger, you know it all comes down to this final confrontation. But before we see how it ends, take a moment to subscribe, because next week we begin an all-new legend that will change everything you think you know about the West. Thomas Drake dismounted at the base of Carson's Bluff, his boots crunching on gravel with deliberate heaviness. He wanted Marcus to hear him coming. Around them, the morning wind carried the sounds of distant gunfire as Sarah's deputies clashed with the governor's men. "Your stance hasn't changed," Marcus called out softly. "Left foot forward, weight balanced for a quick draw. Just like you taught me." Drake smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "And you still cock your head slightly when you're listening. Some habits die hard." He took a few steps forward, his spurs singing with each movement. "It doesn't have to end badly, Marcus. Walk away. There's nothing left for you here. Except justice for the Mackenzies, for all the others you and Harrison murdered to keep your secrets." Marcus's voice carried an edge of steel. "Why, Thomas? What did they offer you?" "Power. Real power." Drake's hand rested casually near his gun. "Do you know what it's like, watching men like Harrison grow rich while we risk our lives upholding their laws? I chose to stop being a slave to their system and start profiting from it instead. And James? Was he just another obstacle?" Drake's voice hardened. "He was a fool, just like you're being a fool now. I taught you everything you know about surviving in darkness, Marcus. Every technique, every trick." "Not everything," Marcus replied quietly. "You taught me to compensate for blindness. But James Mackenzie taught me something far more valuable. He taught me to turn it into a strength." The tension between them stretched like old leather about to snap. Both men could hear the battle shifting in town, knew that everything hinged on these next few moments. "Last chance," Drake offered. "For old time's sake." Marcus shook his head slowly. "You know better. Some things have to be settled with steel." What happened next would be debated in saloons across the territory for years to come. Drake's draw was lightning fast, his technique perfect, just as he'd taught Marcus. But his student had learned new lessons in the years since. Marcus didn't just avoid the first shot. He seemed to flow around it like water around stone. His return fire struck with surgical precision, not aiming to kill, but to disarm. Drake's gun went spinning away along with two of his fingers. "Impossible," Drake gasped, clutching his bleeding hand. "I taught you every move." "No," Marcus responded softly, keeping his peacemaker trained on his former mentor. "You taught me to see without eyes, but the darkness taught me to become something more. Every night spent listening, every hour spent learning the language of sound and air and pressure, they all led to this moment." In town, the gunfire was dying down. Sarah's voice could be heard organizing her deputies, securing prisoners. The conspiracy that had seemed so powerful in shadow couldn't survive exposure to the light. "They'll hunt you," Drake warned, his voice tight with pain and rage. "Harrison has friends in Washington. Connections you can't imagine. Let them come." Marcus holstered his gun with fluid grace. "The darkness will be waiting, and now they'll know what that means." Sarah found them like that minutes later. Drake in custody, Marcus standing quietly in the morning sun. The papers were secure. Blackwood was confessing everything, and Governor Harrison would face justice he couldn't buy his way out of. "It's over," she said softly, touching Marcus's arm. "Almost," he replied, his face turning toward Devil's Fork. "One last thing to do." That evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus Sullivan rode out of Devil's Fork. But the legend of the blind gunslinger didn't end there. It was just beginning. Because sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones you never see coming, and the deepest truths are found in darkness. As for what happened next, well, that's another story for another time.